Well, hello, and thank you so much for joining me today. Um, um, this is going to be first in a series of conversations, which I'm going to call the messy work. Right? So this is about the work that goes on behind the clean white gallery walls and behind the glossy pages of monographs. I've always loved making order out of chaos and this kind of primordial diving into the primordial matter of collections and archives. And I was so lucky for the last year and a half to work with these two amazing people who I think share my passion in this kind of work. So Jenny Hurth is was the executor of the collection of Eli Leon, of his estate. Eli Leon amassed the largest collection of African-American quilts with over 3,000 items, which he kept in his house in Berkeley, California, and in Oakland on the border of with Berkeley. And Stephanie Boris is a registrar and a collections manager with many, many years of experience who helped with organizing collection records. So Eli Leon passed away 2 years ago and bequeathed this amazing collection to the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, where it now resides. And the first exhibition out of this collection opened in February, on February 19th. It's exhibition of the work of one of the quilt makers in this collection, Rosie Lee Tompkins. Unfortunately, because of the time that we live in, because of the pandemic, the exhibition is not currently accessible, but there are resources on the Berkeley Art Museum's website and the images can be seen and the catalog can be purchased. There are white walls, clean floors. The work is perfectly preserved and displayed and looks like the best examples of modern and contemporary art. But we're going to talk about what it took to get to this point, how the real life collections are encountered and what it takes to get them organized so that they can be enjoyed by the public. So let me ask you, Jenny, first, if you could talk about Eli, about his collection and your relationship with Eli and how you ended up in this position.
Well, I met Eli in 2011 through a mutual friend. Eli at the time obviously had his collection of over 3,000 African-American quilts in his house. And in addition to that, he had a collection he'd been working on before he discovered the work of African-American artists. He had been collecting what he called standard traditional quilts, by which he meant just traditional American quilts. So he would buy them and sell them and research them. And, he was quite a determined and applied kind of a guy once he got, onto something. So he probably had 300 or 400 what he called standard traditional quilts in his house, and he needed to get rid of some of them. I had a big art studio at the time. A friend introduced us, and we put on a big sale for his quilts at my studio, and he didn't really like to let things go, which is part of the nature of a lot of collectors. And so we brought 150 quilts down from his extraordinary house to my big studio. We hung them up and we made a beautiful display, invited everybody in the world. And I think he was able to sell 6 quilts. He couldn't quite let them go. So anyway, I met him and I realized he was a person who needed a lot of help, and, you know, a person I knew about because he's very famous in the quilting world. And I just ended up starting to help him try to organize his house. And, you know, within the first year, it became clear that he was starting to struggle with dementia, and I ended up kind of being his caretaker. And it all kind of came from there. It was kind of accidental. It just got introduced and ended up being his caretaker.
And just a little bit of background about Leon. He was a psychologist, and who grew up in the Bronx, I believe.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yes, and spent many years in Berkeley. And I think one of the curious things about this collection is that he started collecting. He encountered the African-American quilters in Berkeley and Richmond and Oakland, because the quilters who migrated from the South after World War II. And he built his network, starting with this local quilt makers, which is unusual. So tell us about how the work was stored and how you managed to help Eli, and then after his passing, to actually make sense of what was packed in his house.
Well, he had this picture you can see of him here. That's him sitting in one of his quilt rooms. He had, I think in the late 80s, built a 2-story extension on his house. It was just like a little sealed 2 rooms, about 11 feet square, that he put on the back of his house. No windows or anything. Full of these metal shelves that you see here, and they were just packed with quilts. So those 2 rooms you could only sidle into sideways. You could barely get in there. And in addition to those 2 rooms being completely packed to the rafters, the whole house, everything except the dining room, including the kitchen, was packed with quilts and textiles, and his attic. The house was completely packed. You walked in there and it was the sound was completely dead because it was full of textiles, like putting your head in a stuffed cotton pillow or something. He had shelves all over the house, and it's hard to describe. It was literally stuffed with textiles.
So what did it take?
Well, sadly, it kind of took him getting so ill that he had to move out and go into dementia care to start actually making sense of the house, because his sense of organization was rather disorganized and very slow and very particular. So you really couldn't get anything done while he was there. So we spent 3 or 4 years pulling out a quilt, looking at it, folding it up and putting it back. We never really got anywhere. But when he moved out, we did organize the house. We ended up selling. His house was also full of ephemera and other things that we sold to support him in memory care. And then I set about putting the art collection into art storage. And the way we did that was I would go to thrift stores and buy sheets and wash the sheets and bring them back, and we would roll up 2 or 3 quilts in a bundle and wrap it up with a sheet and put a label on the end saying which quilts were in it. And we transported those little by little to At How Fine Arts. And that, I don't remember how long that took. That was quite a process, but it was myself and basically my daughters who did that. We rolled them all up, and it ended up taking a space at How that was, I think it was 20 feet tall 12 feet wide and 20 feet deep, packed, with a little aisle of 4 feet between of pallet racks. We jammed that full, and that's how we organized and emptied his house.
And I remember visiting while you were packing.
Yeah.
And kind of that scene of the triage that was going on. Let me move to Stephanie for a second, because then what we realized when we started working together is that we needed, in order to move this work anywhere, to give it to the gives this bequest to the Berkeley Art Museum, to sell some of the pieces to some of the other major art collections. We needed to have an inventory, and we needed to have a record of what there was, who the quilt makers were. Kind of the history of this collection was really important. So then we brought in Stephanie Boris, the job was to decipher the handwritten records accumulated over how many years? Stephanie, do you remember how many years?
30, 40 years.
30, 40 years.
Maybe that long,
of Eli's handwritten ledgers, where he recorded every purchase, where the quilt came from and what date, and some of the notes. So there were boxes and boxes of this notebooks with ledgers, and all of that needed to be transcribed into some kind of a searchable database. So tell us about this process, Stephanie.
Well, initially that's exactly what we thought we would do, is transcribe all the ledgers. But there was a time element involved in needing to get something sooner than later, so that the museum would have a list of what they were actually getting. And as I recall it, the museum actually needed a list in order for the legal process to proceed as far as accepting it. There had to be something that said what they were accepting. And it was quite labor intensive reading these ledgers and transcribing all the information. Each page was, it's sort of like his house, where it was packed. Each page was packed from top to bottom with all this information. And as I recall, I think I did some kind of projection after starting to do it, and it was taking up to 20 or 30 minutes per page to try to get all this captured. And I think this illustrates a really important point about doing this sort of thing, which is that there's really hardly any way you can start off knowing the best way to do it. Even if you've done 100 different inventories, each one is different in terms of what is already there and what condition it's in terms of how decipherable it is, and what is necessary to come out on the other end and how soon. And you have to be flexible about changing the process midstream in order to, as you learn, as I learned about how he kept his records and everything else, things become clearer, and they evolve. So what evolved was a discussion we had where we decided that we were kind of going at it back, but that we might have to back into it by instead accessing the all-important lists that were made on the quilts themselves, organizing those, and then finding the ledger entries corresponding to them. Because to start by just transcribing all the ledgers, that would not tell us what the university was getting, because the ledgers contained quilt after quilt after quilt that was sold or traded. And so we ended up about halfway through, well, maybe more like not halfway through, less than halfway through, fortunately, we decided we would switch gears. And we had someone at how, I believe, or Jenny, did you go in and do this with an assistant photograph?
Yeah, Taz and I took pictures of the
Yeah,
end.
that's right.
Each sausage. Mm-hmm.
And that was wonderful because I then was given scans of all the, well, I was given pictures of the lists that were on all the quilts. And as they packed the quilts, they were not in numerical order. So first we had random numbers, which I then put in an order. And then it was actually not too difficult a process to find those numbers in his ledgers because he kept them all in sequential order. They weren't randomly entered. They were entered as he acquired a quilt, seemingly, and by date. So that's how we did it.
Stephanie, what was some of the like interesting entries or things that you remember sort of encountering that was quirky and unexpected?
Well, I think that what I enjoyed a lot were the entries where he had actually gone to the homes of people. I believe that he traveled around the South of the United States and spoke with a lot of different people, and just the sociology of it was very interesting to me, actually. And he obviously was interested in it as well, to a degree, because he would comment on the different areas that he was in and the different types of, and the family members and the lineage of all these people. And it really gave life to something that I was only seeing in writing. I never touched any of the quilts themselves the whole time I did this project. There was just no way that that was going to happen. And you know, off the top of my head, I can't think of any specific, maybe I will as we talk, but I can't think of any specific instance of one particular instance, but I just thought that a lot of the peripheral information that in a sense wasn't the meat of what was going to be needed in order to get this list together, I really wanted to capture all that. I didn't want to skip anything. As long as it pertained to a quilt that was actually stored at Athow, then I thought it was important to record it.
Well, so this transcription or the database that was created became really the foundation of the database that preserves the knowledge about this collection and about the quilt makers who are represented in the collection. Right? So now it's been, along with the quilts themselves, it's with the Berkeley Art Museum, Pacific Film Archive, where it's built upon, and as new knowledge emerges, you know, new information is added, but it is sort of the skeleton that the future curators will be able to work with, right? So I think we're all of us were extremely lucky that the bequest was made, the gift was made to the museum in time, that the exhibition opened before the pandemic struck, and you know, the public programs took place and the opening took place. Yeah, so this is at the opening on February 19th. It's Jenny in front of one of Rosie Lee Tompkins' quilts, and it was a really kind of a joyous occasion and a wonderful celebration of the work of so many people, including, you know, the makers themselves, Eli, and all the registrars and curators, and Jenny, your work, of course, and of so much labor went into preserving this important collection. And I think it was just a stroke of luck that everything happened when it did happen, right? So,
Yeah.
And so I would like to thank Christopher Squire, KunstWorks Curatorial Associate, for helping us with this presentation. And thank you all very much.